Reports of Wagner Group's demise may have been greatly exaggerated. Are they staging their slow takeover of the Russian Ministry of Defense? We're going to break down just why my early analysis might just have been correct. Plus, Ukrainian gains in Bakhmut. We're going to see just how far they've broken into Russian lines. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's July 10th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get right into it. Okay. First off, let's take a look at the control map. There's been a couple of updates. First and foremost, we look outside of Bakhmut, and you guys can probably see outside of the Burkiva Reservoir, you have Ukrainian forces really making significant advances. This is a tough obstacle to navigate past the reservoir itself, plus crossing over this contested canal. That can be pretty tough, but Ukrainian forces appear to be advancing right into the actual town of Burkiva, which is not itself that large, but it is significant in that an obstacle that was really providing considerable defensive support to Russian forces, this reservoir, has been at least flanked. And I suspect that you may see Ukrainian forces attempt to take and hold the town itself, and then maybe try to dislodge Russian forces from the backside of the reservoir, maybe try to pincer them. As you can see, they might end up in a tight spot if Ukraine can cross this canal here and make some advances, right? I expect Russian forces probably dug in right in these narrow windbreaks, which this is actually a pretty tough position, a tough nut to crack, given that it is a almost 270 degrees of coverage, plus backed, surrounded really by canals for which are going to slow any enemy's advance. So this is a tough one to break up, but certainly running these flanks is going to definitely contribute to that. Moving on, we can see that there's also been some movement here in the north. This is pretty interesting because we don't usually see much movement here, and I'm not aware of too much Ukrainian activity here near Rozdolivka and Vesely. But again, you're seeing Ukrainian forces advancing actually quite a bit, maybe a kilometer or so of distance, and forcing the Russians out of this windbreak here. Again, this I think is a little far off to really constitute a significant flank, but it does show that Russian forces are buckling in places under the strain. However, outside of Debrova, you can see that Russian forces are again making some very limited advances in this very hilly, very forested terrain, right? We've seen that this is tough terrain to really make and hold substantial gains, but Ukrainian forces do appear to have been forced back within this wood line at least several hundred meters in places. But I don't think this is part of a larger Russian offensive effort. I think most Russian offensive work is mostly done as a counterattack or to keep the pressure on Ukrainian forces. When we look over at the combat map, this is what I found interesting. 4 hours ago, the Ukrainian Defense Forces are reporting 1 kilometer advances towards Melitopol and Berdyansk. So this direction and this direction here. Likely it's trying to push outside of Robdine. This is where they've tagged this. Again, this has been a tough spot to try to dislodge Russian forces, and a 1 kilometer advance here could mean continued progress towards Staromayorsk. I think this is a logical assessment that it's an effort to flank and put pressure on Russian forces in Staromayorsk, simply because, again, as we talk about, Staromayorsk is on the west side of this river. Orosayane is occupied by Ukrainian forces on the eastern side, but it'll be very hard for either side to cross that river and drive them out. So for Ukrainians, I think the best bet is to try to put flanking pressure on Russian forces in Staromayorsk, especially because there's only one route out. It's in low ground, and if Ukrainian forces can apply pressure to this route, it can diminish or eliminate the ability of Russian forces to conduct resupply in this area, and runs the risk of having defensive forces here cut off. So I think that's if that's the strategy, I think it's a decent one in a tactical sense. I remain sort of skeptical of Ukraine's ability to really conduct major breakthroughs in Zaporizhzhia, simply because Russian forces have spared no expense to make it defensive. Before we talk, though, about Russia and the Wagner Group, I wanted to quick shout out combatvetnews.com. You guys know sponsors are not huge fans of war content anymore, certainly covering the Ukraine conflict, not quite as beloved by the media as it was a couple months ago. YouTube routinely demonetizes my content, and Patreon, of course, has given me the boot. But if you want to support what I do and help keep me independent, as well as get access to my analysis of the combat footage, the kind of stuff that I can't show you on any of these platforms, you want to become a member. Any one of these tiers is going to, well, one, support me and what I do. Two, get you access to exclusive videos and the members only room on the Discord. You can see that this weekend we actually took a look at how Ukraine is using its Bradleys in somewhat different ways, as well as some really vicious trench warfare. And you can see Ukrainian tactics in this offensive evolving in real time. So if you want access to that, combatvetnews.com, check it out. Links up there and in the description. Okay, let's talk about some interesting news at the Kremlin. Now, this is the Daily Mail, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's reporting that Vladimir Putin has sacked the top general in charge of the war against Ukraine as part of a, quote, purge of top brass. The Daily Mail's ability to do geopolitical analysis is zero, but focus on the facts, which is General Vasily Gerasimov. This is one of the generals that Prigozhin, in his coup attempt, by name, requested that they be ousted. And he has been ousted and replaced by a Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, according to Russian media. Right. The Gerasimov, of course, likely, probably, is ostensibly ousted as part of a purge or possibly inaction in the face of Prigozhin's coup attempt, though it doesn't make a lot of sense simply because Gerasimov has for years, or for months at least, been targeted by Prigozhin as one of his chief rivals. So why then he would be seen as being inappropriately complicit is pretty ridiculous, right? He's literally one of two of the last people who should be forced out. But here's where things get even more interesting. Who is the person replacing him, right? Teplinsky. He is, well, let's take a look. This is an article from April of this year where Teplinsky was also in the news for being appointed. And Teplinsky was appointed in actually June of last year to head the VDV, Russia's elite airborne forces, despite having suffered heavy casualties. Though he had previously been in a senior operational role in January. But what's also most interesting is that Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, and this is again in April, had publicly feuded with the Russian defense establishment, praised Teplinsky. This was in March of 2023, calling him honest, competent, uncompromising, and fearless. So I find that interesting because, well, it makes him sound like he's kind of a pro-Wagner guy. And what is fascinating is that if you were going to purge officers of any Wagner affiliation, the last person you would purge is Gerasimov, and the last person you would promote is someone who is explicitly and consistently praised by Prigozhin, unless, of course, this was the deal, that Gerasimov would go out and he would be replaced with a pro-Wagner individual. You also would see something similar happen with likely in Shoigu, who has had a very low public profile, right? Has had only one real appearance since this coup. I suspect Shoigu is next, and then you may see a Russian Ministry of Interior member also cycled out and replaced with someone who is seen as being closer to Prigozhin and Wagner Group. All of this, of course, is something that I predicted when it happened, that this was the deal that Prigozhin likely struck. He was obviously negotiating in a position of strength and realized that the number one and two obstacles to him being able to succeed Putin were Gerasimov and Shoigu. So having ousted those two and replaced them with lackeys, I think the plan is simply that when Putin retires or rides off into the sunset or passes away, those in power in the Kremlin who really hold the levers to make decisions about who will run the country, they are all already loyal to Prigozhin. And then they will bring him on as either explicitly the leader or as a de facto leader. I actually think that's one of the reasons that Prigozhin also insisted that the charges against him be dropped, because it's not totally, it may be prohibited in Russian law to be able to hold certain levels of elected office if you have pending investigations or have been convicted of a crime. Or, especially, or a crime as serious as mutiny, right? Prigozhin famously as a youth spent, I think, 9 years in Russian prison. So anyway, more evidence that this Wagner coup was not so much abandoned as much as it was purchased on the installment plan. Anyway, thank you guys so much. Thanks as always to our Colonel tier members. You guys know I can't do this without you. You are the ones who make this whole thing possible. Our Lieutenant tier members, seriously, your support means the world to me. You enable me to do this every day and bring you guys the latest on the war. And regardless of whether the news is good or not, I bring you the truthful news as I see it. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you in the next one.